Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today in this educational program organized from the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States, AFPC-USA, and I have the great pleasure to have with us here today for a discussion about the new ways of thinking to ensure food security, Chantal Line Carpentier. Merci beaucoup for joining us.
C'est mon plaisir. It's my
Um,
pleasure.
Chantal Line Carpentier currently serves as the Chief United Nations Conference on Trade and Development at the New York office of the Secretary General since 2014. Previously, she served as Major Groups Coordinator for the UN Development of Economic and Social Affairs, Division for Sustainable Development. She facilitated the engagement and consultation with worldwide non-state actors, NGOs, women groups, business industry, etc., in the Sustainable Development Goals negotiations and the United Nations Rio+20 Conference. Prior to joining the United Nations, she served as Head Environment, Economy and Trade Division of the North America Free Trade Agreement Commission for Environmental Cooperation. Thank you again for joining us here today, Lynn. Chantal Line.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I would like to put a little bit of the framework of what we will discuss today regarding the new ways of thinking to ensure food security. And as we know, the global population grows, and factors like climate change, supply chain, woes, and war impact food supply. Developing tools to ensure more locally grown, sustainable food sources has never been more important, as we all, I think, we agree. Here, here we will discuss on how public and private innovators embrace new tools and new ways of thinking to solve this pressing challenge. I would like to have a little bit of a first overview from you, Chantal Line, about, in general, where we stand right now in regards to food security and what are the most pressing challenges.
Well, thank you so much, Thanos. And unfortunately, I don't have good news for you. Um, there's about 2.4 billion people that suffer from food insecurity right now. And just to put that number in perspective, that's as many people we were on this planet after World War II. That's how many people are food insecure. That's the entire population after World War II. And this is because of the rising food and energy prices and the sustained inflation that we're all seeing, right? And basically, what's happening is the COVID-19 in itself, right, added about 150 million of hungry people in 2021 alone. Then the war in Ukraine compounded that, adding another 50 million. So now we're 200 million people more hungry, more hungry people than they were before the COVID and the war in Ukraine. And we expect this number is actually probably closer to 350. These were numbers into 2022. So now we expect those numbers to be closer to 350 million. And half of those are children under age of 18. And this is a massive lack of human security, as you can imagine, right? And we have been trying to address these issues by reducing the inflationary pressure on prices, on food prices and fuel prices, through the Global Crisis Response Group, because we just don't have the capacity to go and deliver humanitarian help to hundreds of millions of people. And so we're trying to address this to the market, through the Global Crisis Response Group, the Black Sea Initiative, where we're getting millions of metric tons of grain out of Ukraine. And so that's kind of where we stand and what we are facing. People are not just facing a food crisis, they're facing a food, a finance, and a fuel crisis. And that is really threatening the very fabric of our nations.
And what is the answer? Is the answer a new creative thinking approach, a new action plan? How would we describe?
Well, there's several answers. So on the one hand, right, trade was very necessary to ensure that net food importing countries will get access to enough food to feed their population. And then, sadly enough, there's more and more countries that are net food importer, and more people in those countries that don't produce their own food. And the problem is compounded by the increase in the Fed's interest rate to control inflation in these countries, creating inflationary pressure in those countries, and depreciating the currency of those countries, making the food even more expensive to import, and less they're reducing their ability to support their own population. So on the one hand, we need to maintain trade open so they can have access to the food because they haven't developed their productive capacity. On the second hand, we need to develop that homegrown productive capacity, a little bit of autonomy to produce their own food. We saw the Caribbean following the food crisis decided that as a region they will produce 20% of their food in the region, collaborating together, so that you do not fully depend on markets. So you need a balance between the two, and you need a balance between the short term and the long term. And all of this while considering what are you going to invest all this money that you should probably have invested before, right? You basically need to take into account the fact that we have climate change, and you're going to have to adapt to climate change, and therefore you're going to have more drought, you're going to have more heavy rainfall, and therefore these investments need to be climate proof as well, so they don't get washed out with the first big disaster we're going to have. So the answer is also, Thanos, it's solidarity. These countries, especially developing countries, do not have the fiscal capacity right now to support their population because the COVID-19 hit their hard. Their economy was only partially recovering because they were not able to give the stimulus that our country gave. And then the war in Ukraine hit. So these countries are strained for money. On top of it, the cost of servicing their external debt went up as the interest rate went up, as their currency went down. So it's a compounding crisis that requires our solid international solidarity, because our food system are interdependent. Our political system are interdependent. We saw that our health system are interdependent, and climate change is affecting all of us. And if you can't feed your children at home, you're going to move to a country where you can feed your children. We're seeing mass migration, and we can expect more climate migration. So we're all in this together, and we need to work together. And that will include alleviating some of the debt from those countries, and the fact that a lot of these debt are nothing of their doing. These are exogenous shocks. Developing countries did not create the COVID-19. They did not create climate change, and they did not create the war in Ukraine. And yet they are more affected and least able to adapt to those shocks.
And how would we say that the West, the developed economies, are willing to work towards this direction of alleviating the burden of the
Unfortunately, I don't think the political appetite is there. I don't think I think we need to help our decision makers understand and communicate to the population this interdependence. I don't think people do realize that we are all, you can't just sit in your living room and think that it's going to be all right if all these countries fail, because they default on their debt, they don't feed their population, there's social unrest, political vacuum, and then you get these failed government, and this is where terrorism comes out. This is where you get all, so we all in this together. We cannot kid ourselves that we're independent and we can isolate ourselves from it. So unfortunately, the political will is not there. The political will to help with the debt is not there. There's been a little bit of special issuing of special drawing rights from the IMF to support a little bit developing country, give them liquidity. What they need right now is liquidity, right? Which they don't have, for a social protection floor for people. And then we need to help them invest in their own productive capacity, as I mentioned, to produce food, healthy food, and in a environmentally sound way, as well as produce their own renewable energy if we want to avoid, because these countries are also the least electrified, and they're going to have to produce to increase their capacity. If they have to go to fossil fuel, we're not helping ourselves either, because now there's going to be more CO2 in the atmosphere, more climate change impact, and therefore we have an incentive, but somehow I feel we're not communicating that to our population. And to be frank, social media platform are not helping either, because it's an incentive to, it's more remunerating to spread misinformation and false information and polarization than actually valid information about these issues.
And on the top of that, we also have the climate change, and we have the challenges that we face with the rain-fed agriculture. How are we going to be able to have developed an alternative to address this challenge related to the food insecurity?
Well, this is where I think the good news is. There are the digitalization of the economy, the rise of startups, and the capacity to move the entrepreneurship with the digital capacity is has reduced tremendously the cost of these technology and the wide access by generally pretty much everybody to use these technologies. And what we need is, instead of having intensive agriculture, we need data intensive agriculture. So we put the water where we need it, the fertilizers where we need it, and we can use satellite data. We can use sensors to sense the soil to see exactly what fertilizer, what potassium, what nitrogen, what phosphorus we need at what point in time. So we reduce the environmental impact, we reduce the cost, and we increase production. And we have the capacity to do that. Now we just need to ensure that those that need it the most get access to these technologies.
And we mentioned climate change. We of course have the droughts, and the question is: are there any alternatives to irrigation, fertilizers, etc., that can help farmers grow crops year round? You
Well,
mentioned the particularly also you mentioned the digitalization and the important role it plays, but what other?
Well, on the one hand, I wouldn't say that you want to reduce fertilizer use in Africa because their soil are depleted because they haven't used enough fertilizers, right? So they need fertilizers. And this is actually something we're trying to do at the UN by trying to get it's the memorandum with Russia to try to get Russia produce and export 25% of fertilizers of the world export. It's 25% coming from Russia. So we need to get these fertilizers out because right now the price of fertilizers have increased by 200% for African farmers. They can't afford it and they need it the most. So for them, the solution is not to reduce fertilizer use, is actually to increase the fertilizers and have access to it and it in quantity, but also to be able to afford it. In terms of irrigation, we always have countries that are ahead of the curve. So in this case, Israel has always been ahead of the curve because of the lack of water in the region, and they've developed technologies on drip irrigation where you do not lose as much water in evaporation and in it's leaking to the aquifer. You basically just have drip irrigation directly to the plant at the time when you need it. So there are technologies like this that do exist to help farmers. We also can now increasingly have very precise biotechnology where you can actually, it's no longer like when I was in grad school, right? It was like a shoot in the dark. You would shoot gene from a different crop or animals into a plant to make them resistant to, say, freezing. Now you can actually go very precisely exactly on that gene, turn it on, turn it off. And so this technology exists. But for drought adaptation, for pest adaptation, for um, all of these issues, right? But at the same time, these technology needs to be accessible to developing countries. And we need to involve researchers from the South in our research. But because of the reputation that bioengineered crop had in the past, many countries still remain careful about the issues of biotechnologies. And yet, some of these new technologies hold many of these answers.
So there are technologies. The question is how these technologies can be accessed to developing countries where they need it the most, and also how
Exactly.
you can educate the societies in these countries to accept these technologies, to integrate them, right?
Correct. Correct. And then the capacity of researchers in those countries to perhaps tweak them and better adapt them to their own setting and their own environment and endowment.
And again, the role of developed economies is crucial, even on that aspect of how you support the developing economies to have these technologies imported and support also the local society of scientists to how they can adopt these technologies.
Exactly. And as you know, many of these technologies are with the universities or with the private sector. So what incentive, how do we incentivize the private sector to do ensure there's access to some of these patent and these intellectual properties in developing country through joint venture, to partnership, to ensure that these technology gets there, and yet it doesn't reduce the incentive that these tech companies have to invest in these technologies, because they need to get to some return from their investment. So we need to rebalance these cost and benefit for our private sector as well, through the public sector investment and facilitation and collaboration.
Mhm. So a lot of actions can be undertaken. There is a lot of room on behalf of the developed economies and the governments. But also the question is what is related to the society consensus? When we have like divisions inside our societies, whether or not climate change is a real issue or not, how we can bring people together to fight in a collective manner against this issue of climate change, which affects and impacts food insecurity, supply chain, and everything.
Yeah, and this is where honestly the media like you and the UN like us, I think, comes into play. And oftentimes we don't work closely enough, because then the UN is, with all its flaw, is the place where we do convene the entire world. All of the countries get convened, they have a voice, and we can discuss these issues. Because climate change and water scarcity and inflation, all of these issues, no country can resolve these issues alone. We need to resolve these issues together. And so, but how do we then fight misinformation? How do we fight fake news? How do we? And this is where, a better partnership. And how do we communicate? I feel the environmental movement, and I'm one of them, so I think I can say we've been terrible at communicating the environmental issues and climate change issues. We've been focusing on the negative impact and fear factor, as opposed to reassembling and bringing people together, offering solution, which we all overwhelmed by our life to start with. We don't need one more doomsday news, right? So how do we ensure people feel empowered and give them options to get involved and be part of the solution? I think we need to do more of that.
So we need to reconsider the messaging around climate change. Do you think the UN is willing to take the pioneering role on that?
Well, as you know, the UN has already have the UNFCCC, the UN, and we have the IPCC, which is the scientists coming together to get. So this already exists. The problem is the science is there, and what we're all seeing now, and it's really affecting human security, is the discreditation of science and scientists. Like you're an expert because have a platform and you have a blog, and all of a sudden you're an expert on something, right? So that science is there. We have the convening, we do, but we need to somehow bring people with us. We need to give incentive that for the right information to get to people, not whatever information, if somebody has the money to put forward for people to receive it. Because climate change is there. I mean, there people that I don't know about you, but I do feel that people that are still climate deniers, it has to be almost like a religious thing, because how can you be against all the facts that we're seeing, right? I mean, it's pretty clear, the drought, the disasters, the fires, everything. the melting of the glaciers, the even changing of the streams, the wind streams, and the ocean acidification. All of these are facts. These are scientific fact established, and the IPCC has established that it's above 90 some percent that sure that it's human caused, that these climate change. So again, it's a matter of, we have the science. Somehow we've not been able to elect perhaps the right official to represent us, so they will represent the interests of the majority and not the interests of a few um, fossil fuel companies or others that have an interest in the status quos, and the way of communicating to the population. We should be able to explain climate change to our old 90 years old aunt. And I don't know if you can, but I can't. And yet we should all be able to do that.
Absolutely, and the data are there. What we're experiencing in our everyday lives in regards to the side effects of the climate change crisis is there. I just have the feeling that people don't get this, I would say, threat about their future related to the climate change too personally, because they feel it is going to be outside of their lifespan. That the real damage in our climate environment may happen after our lives end. And this goes on, and the generation next to the generation is just thinking that what it's coming as a threat is related to the future, doesn't affect our lifespan.
You've got a point there, because one of the things that UN Secretary General Guterres has put forward is a summit of the future next year in September. And we're going to review some of the marching orders in September this year at the General Assembly. And three of the topics are related to what you just mentioned. How do you give a voice to the future generation, the decision we're making now, right? Um, how do we measure progress beyond just GDP? Because GDP, if you have forest fires because of climate change, you increase your GDP. But you've destroyed your forest, but it doesn't matter. That doesn't get counted in the GDP. So we are developing, he's mandated the UN system to work on measure beyond GDP that will actually measure the well-being of people and the planet. And so instead of having one number to measure the progress of countries and people, it would be maybe 10, 20 measure that our decision makers would have in front of them. And you can actually see the trade-off between social, environmental, and economic, right? While right now, what we're doing is maximizing profit and economic dimension at the expense of the social and the environmental, given our status quo of economic models and financial models. And that needs to change. And this is something that the Secretary General has actually tasked us to work on. And we have a brief that will be coming out pretty shortly on what is it that we should measure for the well-being of people, and also this issue of distributional, right? GDP has been increasing at exponential rate, and yet we have more poverty, more inequality, more environmental destruction than ever before. So clearly, we're not measuring the right thing, and we also don't have the right economic model. We need new economic model for sustainable development that advance at least not just one of the three dimensions, like economic, but either advance economic and social or environmental without regressing on any of the others. And they are model. The people talk about the green economy, but there's the blue economy, there's the care economy, there's the circular economy, there's the social solidarity economy. All of these models exist. We need to basically document them, document business model that support them, and make them more, make our startups, our entrepreneurs, our MSMEs more aware of them, so that they can advance business model that are actually pro people, pro planet, and pro profit, and not one at the expense of the others.
I would like to put in the table of our discussion also the term poverty, because this is also related to the food insecurity. And we discuss about tools, technological, new technologies, or other actions on behalf of developed economies to support developing countries regarding food insecurity? What about poverty? Is it similar? Is it identical issue, the other side of the food insecurity, or it is two separate issues that needs to be addressed independently from each other?
That's a very good question. It's a bit tricky. So before the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, right, the major drivers of food insecurity was not enough gainful employment so you could afford the food, right? Now it's pretty much it's the cost of crisis. It's basically you have to choose between having a meal or paying for the medicines, right? So we're really getting at a point where now it's these things are all getting intertwined. Before we were saying let's build productive capacity, let's create jobs, decent job, and then poverty will just disappear. And we were doing some serious progress before the pandemic, right? The poverty had been systematically decreasing. China got hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the shortest lifespan ever. But the problem is now the human security, the poverty has started increasing again. Food insecurity is increasing again. But that food security had started before the pandemic. Poverty has only started after the pandemic. Um, and to me, it goes back to what we were just talking about, Dennis, is we have the wrong economic models and we measure the wrong thing in terms of progress, and this is why we are there. We say GDP is going to increase, and this is when I was in grad school 30 years ago. We said if you increase GDP, you increase trade, it's going to increase GDP, it's going to lift all boat, right? Everybody's going to be lifted at the same time. And we saw it's not true. You need distributional policies. Trade will increase GDP, but who's going to benefit from trade? Who's going to benefit from the increase in GDP is not everybody equally. If you didn't have access to market before a trade agreement, you're still not going to have access to market after. You need the road, you need the port, you need the productive capacity, you need electricity. Many of these places don't have electricity. How are they going to have gainful employment and make a decent wage if they don't have access to electricity? Are they supposed to compete with our industries when their electricity gets shut down 12 hours a day, right? They
Absolutely.
can compete in their cost of production. So poverty is a symptom of the structural problem that we have in our economic and financial system and our lack of solidarities among human beings.
And let's also add another term in our discussion: supply chain. We heard the President Biden in the Union address speech that the supply chain in America needs to start and in America needs to begin in America. Diversifying the supply chain is potentially the response to challenges related to food insecurity.
Well, two things. Yes, the answer is yes. Diversification is definitely what COVID showed us is we were not diversified in our procurement of protection equipment. And what the war in Ukraine showed us is that many of our countries depend for more than 50% of their grain from one or two countries. And that's problematic. I mean, if you go to your financial advisor, first thing is going to, or he or she's going to tell you is diversify your portfolio. So if one stock or one fund goes up, the other one's going to go down, then you're protected. Why were we so dependent on one or two countries? But the problem is, I'm not sure the American plan that Mr. Biden has put forward is actually diversification. They're basically relocalization. They want these things to be produced in America by American. And so that means you're not diversifying, right? You're basically now you may go completely. It's like a pendulum, and you may go completely the other way in a way that may not be productive. Because what if something happened in the productive capacity in America? You want to have some diversification, but definitely the idea behind it is right. Is you do not want to put all your eggs in the same basket. You want to diversify your sourcing of your input of your food, especially the basic needs. Um, And in the past, again, because of the economic model that we have and the we measure progress, we've maximized efficiency at the cost of resilience. Now we've realized we're interdependent. We can't isolate our economy, our health system from everybody else. Therefore, we need resilience. And climate change shows us we need resilience. So we're seeing a rebalancing in the supply chain of, okay, I want still efficiency, but not, I cannot afford to not have resilience. Therefore, I'm going to produce some on my own. I'm going to have some closer to home, my regional neighbors, and maybe some of those that I've been more friendly with in the past, so that I have a supply chain that is more secure. And the jury's still out as to what's going to happen, but it's really a risk management strategy. While in the past, which we should have done in the past, instead of depending on one or two countries.
So it is the right strategy, this diversification of supply chains as a management approach, as a management policy, right?
It is. I don't think any one country, I wouldn't want my family to depend on food
Anyone?
only
Yeah.
from one grocery store. Because if that grocery store goes bankrupt, I can't feed my family, right? Or your pharmacian, you want to know that there's more than one pharmacy you can get your medicine that your life depend on from. So yes, diversification is definitely something. This is something at UNCTAD we've been saying for developing countries. They need to diversify their economy. It's the same principle. Their economy depend on one or two export of one or two um, major commodities, whether it's a grain, whether it's a mining like gold or nickel, or and we say no, you got to diversify your economy so you're not dependent on the foes and fear of the market. And if the price goes down, your whole economy goes down of the one commodity you depend on. But it's the same principle for our supply chain. What if the price of that one input that you need, like the chips for our cars, right, that we saw during the pandemic, what if it becomes unaffordable? We can't rely on just one country or one supply chain, one producer for these things.
Do you see any upcoming problem with, say, new problem of supply chains in the near future?
I think what we're seeing right now is a restructuring of these supply chain all over. I'll give you an example. The Caribbean have decided that 20% of their food they're going to produce in the region, right? So that's, and then they're also looking at how, for the rest of their import, how they're going to deal with that. Um, the we're also seeing, and this is a summit that we had last year, a summit of the food system. In the past, we've kind of dealt with food and agriculture separately. And yet these need to be get together, right? And SDG 2 is about sustainable agriculture and food and nutritious food. So how do we change our supply chain? While we're changing our supply chain, how do we ensure we have more nutritious food that is affordable to all, as opposed to where you see in some areas where families have to buy chips because that's the only thing they can afford. They can't buy an apple for each children, right? For each child that they have. So while we're doing these restructuring, we need to think about human security as a whole, so that we get out of this cost of living crisis, so that you no longer have a security problem for securing health of your children, securing their food, their shelter, and employment. How do we ensure that we do that? And diversification of our economy, of our supply chain, is one of the way we do that. Social protection, a minimum social protection for the most vulnerable, is also needed. So we're all at risk of something happening to us, but there should be a safety net that in that period when we lost our job, or where you've been on you're sick and you can't work, that your children do not have to suffer during that period. And so I hope that this will be a awareness rising event where people will realize that we are vulnerable, we are interdependent, we need to support the most vulnerable, and we can do it.
How we could conclude with five principles or three principles of ensuring food security? What could we keep as a major conclusion points as an outcome of our discussion?
I would think, there's something like, and I may be wrong about the number, but it's something like $450 billion in subsidies in agriculture yearly. We could repurpose, not eliminate, repurpose. Instead of going to the agriculture that we have, where 90% of this is environmentally detrimental, repurpose it towards sustainable and nutritious food production. That would be one step. Second, would be uh, keeping trade flowing. No food, no export on ban on certain food or crops or product, because there are countries that depend on them, right? And the third would be more solidarity, more building the capacity, helping developing countries to develop their own capacity to, at least at the regional level, to have enough food self-sufficiency to, say, be able to have food for 2 months in advance and have some reserve, right? As well. So I think these three could would go a long way.
Last question: are tariffs on global trade affecting any way the food security?
Yes, definitely. We have the Uruguay round that was never completed, and that was supposed to be liberalization of agriculture, and that was never completed. The Doha round, I'm sorry, was never completed, and this is where the developing countries have a comparative advantage. They have the cheap labor, they have the land, they have the capacity to produce. So why don't we? And we never completed that round that would have given them an advantage. So going back to ensure, if food security is really a human right, which it is, right? How do we ensure that food security? We by helping them build their capacity to produce food and trade, sell those food to us, we would actually decrease their poverty in, and reduce the food insecurity worldwide. And so it's the advantage of all, but that goes through our trade system, and it goes through the subsidies that we have that are distorting.
Thank you very much for this insightful conversation, Chantal Line Carpentier. I really appreciate your time and speaking with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.